Quintinshill rail disaster. On May 22, 1915, the morning fog hung low over the Scottish countryside near Gretna Green as a troop train carrying soldiers of the 7th Royal Scots Battalion thundered south along the Caledonian Main Line toward Liverpool, the men inside bound for the beaches of Gallipoli. What awaited them was nothing like what they had been told to expect. At the Quintinshill signal box, the two signalmen on duty, James Tinsley and George Meakin, were operating well outside their normal procedures. They had been illegally changing shifts after the morning express had passed, and Tinsley had been distracted from his duties by the task of copying up the train register to conceal his late arrival. A northbound local passenger train had been shunted onto the southbound main line to clear the passing loops, both of which were already occupied by goods trains. Tinsley was told about it. He acknowledged it. Then he forgot about it entirely. When the southbound troop train was accepted from the next signal box, no one raised an alarm. The soldiers packed into antiquated wooden carriages, lit by gas lamps, and traveling at full speed slammed directly into the stationary local passenger train without any warning whatsoever. 1 minute later, while survivors were still crawling from the wreckage, a northbound express plowed into the pile of debris from the other direction. Ruptured gas lines ignited immediately, and the wooden carriages, many of them still filled with men who could not free themselves from the crushed compartments, were consumed by fire in minutes. Soldiers reportedly begged those outside to shoot them rather than let them burn. Many bodies were never recovered, cremated entirely where they lay. At least 226 people died, and 246 were injured, making it the deadliest rail disaster in British history, a record that still stands today. The two signalmen were convicted of culpable homicide and jailed, then quietly released and reinstated to railway work within the year. It was wartime, and the disaster was overshadowed almost immediately by news from the Western Front. The regiment the troop train carried, the 7th Royal Scots, was essentially destroyed before it ever reached the theater of war. Those who survived Quintinshill were later killed at Gallipoli. The true death toll was never precisely confirmed because the fire had consumed the regiment's own roll call list kept aboard the train, leaving no definitive record of exactly who had been on board. Gaisal train collision. On August 2nd, 1999, just after 1:30 in the morning, the Avad Assam Express from New Delhi and the Brahmaputra mail from Guwahati were both traveling across a remote stretch of railway in West Bengal, India, each carrying hundreds of sleeping passengers through the dark. 3 of the 4 tracks on the line were closed that night for maintenance work, leaving only a single pair of tracks in operation. That alone demanded extreme care from the station staff. Instead, a station master at Kishanganj manually set the wrong points, diverting the Awadh Assam Express onto the down main line, the exact track the Brahmaputra mail was already traveling on in the opposite direction. The incorrect information was then passed forward to the next station. Nobody corrected it. At Gaisal station, both trains were traveling at an estimated 80 to 100 kilometers per hour when they met each other head-on in the darkness. Witnesses said the impact was so violent, the engine of the express was blasted several feet into the air. 14 carriages and both locomotives were completely destroyed on impact. Fire swept through the wreckage moments later, burning those still trapped alive inside the mangled coaches. The nearest major hospital was a 14-hour drive from the crash site. By the time meaningful rescue resources arrived from Calcutta, many of those who might have been saved with faster care were already dead. The official death toll was set at 285, though unofficial estimates placed it significantly higher, with some witnesses claiming over 1,000 people perished in total. No one walking near that station that morning had any way of knowing the 2 trains were converging, because the air was never caught at any of the intermediate stations the Awadh Assam passed through on its way to disaster. Following the crash, India's railway minister resigned, taking moral responsibility for a chain of human failures that stretched from a single set of manually misplaced points all the way to the top of the ministry. Eschede train disaster. On June 3rd, 1998, a German intercity express train known as the Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen was traveling at 200 kilometers per hour, or about 125 miles per hour, on the route between Munich and Hamburg, carrying 287 passengers. The ICE was Germany's engineering pride, the fastest and most technologically advanced passenger train in the country, a symbol of precision and modernity. What nobody aboard knew was that a single tire on one of the first carriage's wheels had been developing a fatigue crack for months. The wheel was a new, resilient design fitted with a rubber damping ring meant to smooth out vibrations for passengers, a system adapted from tramway engineering but never truly tested at high speed over millions of revolutions of stress. Engineers at Deutsche Bahn's Munich maintenance facility had since discontinued use of the specialized equipment designed to detect internal metal fatigue because it kept generating false positives. Standard flashlights were used instead. 3 automated checks in the week before the disaster had flagged the wheel as potentially defective, and 8 separate complaints had been logged by staff about unusual vibrations from the same bogie 2 months before the crash. None of it triggered a wheel replacement. At 10:57 a.m., the weakened tire finally snapped at full speed, the strip of metal drilling upward through the carriage floor between 2 occupied seats. A passenger immediately told the train manager, who walked to investigate rather than pulling the emergency brake. By the time anyone understood what was happening, the trailing piece of detached tire had been dragged along the track and lodged itself inside a railroad switch, physically flipping the points as the train passed over them. The rear carriages were redirected onto an adjacent track, while the front continued forward, tearing the train apart at high speed. The separated rear coaches slammed into the concrete pillars of a road bridge crossing the track at Eschede, and the bridge collapsed directly onto the carriages below, crushing the passengers inside under hundreds of tons of concrete. The remaining coaches piled into the wreckage. 101 people were killed, and 88 more seriously injured, making it the deadliest high-speed rail accident in history. After the crash, rescue workers discovered they couldn't break through the carriage windows to reach survivors, prompting Deutsche Bahn to redesign every ECE window with preset breaking points to allow emergency access. Ladbroke Grove rail crash. On October the 5th, 1999, just after 8 o'clock in the morning, a Thames Trains commuter service departed Platform 9 at London Paddington, carrying 147 passengers westbound. At the same moment, a First Great Western high-speed train was approaching Paddington from the opposite direction at up to 100 miles per hour, carrying 421 passengers, its passengers largely unaware of what was about to happen. 2 minutes into its journey, the Thames Trains driver passed signal SN109, a red stop signal located barely 2 miles from the station, mounted on a gantry that was partially obscured by a road bridge overhead, and by overhead electric catenary that had been installed years after the original signal sighting was designed. Signal SN109 had been passed at red by no fewer than 8 previous drivers in the 16 months before the crash, a statistic recorded in internal audits that were never acted upon. No risk assessment was ever completed, despite repeated recommendations to conduct one. At 8:09 a.m., the 2 trains collided almost head-on at a combined closing speed of roughly 130 miles per hour. The first carriage of the Thames train was destroyed on impact. Diesel fuel from the front of the train ignited instantly, and a fireball tore through the rear coaches, engulfing passengers who had survived the initial collision. 31 people were killed, including both drivers, and more than 417 were injured. The disaster was the second major head-on collision on the Great Western Main Line in just over 2 years, following the Southall crash of 1997, which had been caused by the same failure mode, a driver passing a signal at danger. Both crashes, investigators later concluded, would have been prevented by automatic train protection technology that could physically stop a train from passing a red signal technology Britain had already evaluated, found workable, and then rejected on cost grounds before either crash occurred. The inquiry found that signal SN109 had been notoriously difficult to see clearly at speed, one of the contributing factors, and that the railway company responsible for maintaining the signaling had a documented internal culture described by investigators as one of apathy and lack of will to follow up promised actions. It was the kind of conclusion that appeared in a formal report, was reported in the newspapers for a week, and then stopped most of the trains running on time. Graniteville train disaster. On January 6, 2005, in the small town of Graniteville, South Carolina, a Norfolk Southern freight train rolled through the town in the early morning hours while most residents were still asleep. The train was carrying tank cars loaded with chlorine gas, a highly toxic industrial chemical used in water treatment facilities, along with other cargo. At just after 2:30 a.m., the train ran through a misaligned switch at a cotton mill siding and derailed at speed, puncturing several of the chlorine tank cars. A massive cloud of chlorine gas immediately began spreading outward from the wreckage, dense and invisible in the dark, moving through the surrounding neighborhood at ground level, exactly where people were sleeping with their windows closed. The train's engineer, Christopher Sealing, was killed inside his cab, overcome by gas, before he could escape. Within the first few minutes, the gas reached the nearby textile plant, where workers on the night shift collapsed where they stood. Residents woke up coughing, burning, unable to breathe, and stumbled out of their homes into a fog of poison. 9 people died in total, the majority killed by gas inhalation, in the minutes after the derailment, and more than 250 were injured, many with serious respiratory damage. Over 5,400 people had to be evacuated from the surrounding area, some unable to return for weeks, while cleanup crews worked to neutralize the spilled chemical. Investigators later found the derailment was caused by the switch having been left in the wrong position by a crew that had used it hours earlier, a simple procedural failure that went unverified before the freight train arrived. The disaster prompted a comprehensive national review of how chemical-carrying freight trains route through populated areas during overnight hours, and whether communities along those routes have any meaningful ability to respond when cargo spills without warning in the dark. Amagasaki rail disaster. On April 25, 2005, in Japan, a commuter train on the JR Fukuchiyama line, traveling between Itami and Amagasaki, was running 90 seconds behind schedule. The train's 23-year-old driver, Ryujiro Takami, had overshot the platform at the previous station by 72 meters, a mistake that required him to manually reverse the train back to the correct stopping position, costing him precious time on a line known for its strict adherence to timetable. In the culture of JR West at the time, drivers who ran late faced formal disciplinary hearings, mandatory retraining programs known informally as day camps, and public humiliation within the company. Takami was already under intense personal anxiety about the delay as he accelerated toward a sharp 60 km per hour curve at Amagasaki. He was traveling at 116 kilometers per hour, almost double the posted speed limit for that section when the first carriage left the rails. The train derailed completely on the curve, the first 3 carriages slamming into the reinforced concrete wall of an apartment building beside the track with catastrophic force. The front carriage was crushed almost entirely flat against the building's car park. 107 passengers were killed and more than 550 injured in the deadliest railway accident in Japan in more than 4 decades. The investigation that followed exposed a systematic culture of fear inside JR West, where management pressure to eliminate delays had created exactly the conditions that made a young driver push a dangerous curve at twice its safe speed, gambling seconds of time against the safety of every passenger aboard. It also emerged as that while the derailment was occurring, some JR West employees were playing golf and completed their round before reporting to the crash site. Others attended a bowling event organized by the company. The resulting public outrage in Japan went far beyond the crash itself, reshaping how railway companies across the country were expected to treat both safety culture and the human pressures placed on frontline workers. Viareggio train derailment. On June 29, 2009, just after midnight, a freight train carrying 25 LPG tanker wagons derailed at the Central Railway Station in Viareggio, a coastal town in Tuscany, Italy, while most of the city was asleep. The derailment was caused by a cracked axle on the leading wagon, a defect that had been developing for months inside a piece of equipment that investigators later found had been manufactured in Germany, maintained in Austria, and placed into service in Italy, moving through 3 separate national regulatory regimes without a single complete inspection specifically adapted to the failure mode that ultimately caused it. When the axle broke, the tank wagon fell onto its side and ruptured, releasing a massive wave of liquefied petroleum gas across the station platform, and the surrounding streets. The gas ignited almost instantly, creating a fireball that engulfed the station and swept along the nearby streets, where several apartment buildings stood only meters from the track. Residents waking to the sound of the derailment found their streets already on fire before they could escape. 32 people were killed, many of them burned alive in their homes, in the seconds before they had any chance to understand what was happening to them. Over 20 others were severely injured, and hundreds had to be evacuated from the wider area. The disaster became a defining case in European rail freight safety, exposing how the liberalization of cross-border rail freight on the continent had outpaced the harmonization of safety standards, allowing equipment to circulate internationally through gaps in regulatory oversight that no single country was in a clear position to close. Odisha train collision. On June 2nd, 2023, near the town of Bahanaga Bazar in Odisha, India, the Coromandel Express, a high-speed passenger service carrying hundreds of people from Kolkata toward Chennai, was diverted by a signaling error onto a looped track instead of the main line. The loop track was already occupied by a stationary goods train carrying iron ore. The Coromandel Express struck the goods train at full speed, and the force of the impact sent 21 of its coaches derailing violently off the tracks, 3 of them tumbling directly into the path of the SMVT Bengaluru Dahora Superfast Express, which was simultaneously traveling on the adjacent track in the opposite direction. The overturned carriages wiped the approaching train off the rails as well. In less than a minute, 3 separate trains had been destroyed at the same location, leaving a sprawl of crushed carriages and trapped passengers across multiple tracks in both directions. Emergency services were overwhelmed within the first hour. Local hospitals filled beyond capacity. Crane teams worked through the night by floodlight trying to peel apart layers of wreckage and reach passengers trapped inside compacted coaches. Some survivors were pulled from the rubble more than 24 hours after the initial crash. When the rescue operation was finally declared complete, 296 people were confirmed dead and more than 1,200 injured, making it the deadliest rail accident in India in more than 2 decades. Investigators traced the cause to a fault in the electronic signaling system that sent the Coromandel Express onto the loop line rather than the main line, and questions were raised publicly about why India's collision avoidance system, which had been announced and partially funded years earlier, had still not been installed on this stretch of track at the time of the disaster. Buenos Aires train crash. On February 22, 2012, during morning rush hour, a commuter train packed with passengers approached the once railway station in Buenos Aires, Argentina, one of the busiest stations in the country. The train, which should have begun decelerating well before reaching the end of the platform, failed to slow down. It struck the end of the line at the terminus buffer at full speed. The impact compressed the front carriage like an accordion, telescoping it backward into the second coach with devastating force. 51 people were killed in the collision, the majority of them crushed in the first 2 carriages, and more than 700 were injured in one of the worst peacetime rail disasters in Argentine history. The investigation revealed a catastrophic accumulation of neglect. The train's braking system had been malfunctioning for weeks. Before the crash, the company responsible for maintenance had been filing falsified records. Government oversight inspections had not been properly conducted in the period leading up to the crash, and the automatic speed control system that should have stopped the train from running unchecked into the station had never been functioning correctly. Nearly every safety layer designed to prevent exactly this kind of crash had been silently degraded by corruption, falsified paperwork, and cost-cutting that stretched from the train operator through multiple levels of government oversight. The company's executives and government officials were eventually convicted of negligence and fraud. The investigation also determined that the concession to operate the line had been repeatedly renewed by the government despite years of documented safety failures, creating a system where contractors had little incentive to maintain equipment they knew would continue to be paid regardless. Survivors later described the moment of the impact as a single violent lurch that gave no warning and no time for anyone in the front carriages to do anything at all. Looking across all 9 of these disasters, from a Scottish signal box in 1915 to a rush hour terminus in Buenos Aires in 2012, What stands out is rarely the catastrophic nature of any single failure. What stands out is how many of them required multiple smaller failures to line up in sequence before anyone died. A signal misread and a crack in a wheel tire, a wrong switch and a misread roster, a red light ignored, and a cost-benefit analysis that chose money over automatic protection. The train doesn't have to be going fast. The chemical doesn't have to be exotic. The mistake doesn't have to be malicious. It just has to be the last one in a chain that nobody bothered to check. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for similar ones, and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments below.